Hello from the Sourdough Labs. So today we're going to look at how we activate Steve the sourdough starter when we get him in the post, and also some troubleshooting questions that I often get asked when Steve's not behaving. And this is mostly because I can't control the postage conditions, so I don't know where it will be, whether it will be put somewhere warm or somewhere cold, and that affects how active the starter will be when it arrives to you. So you get Steve in the post. Here he is, his 50 grams of white starter. And what we do is we take that and we put it all into a jug or any other mixing vessel. Now it will seem quite runny. This is because while it's fermenting, it's producing alcohol, and that's a liquid, so they kind of all mixes in during the post, so it will arrive to you quite running. And all we're going to do is to that add 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water. Give it a mix. If you bought one of the starter kits, you can mix it in the jar. If you see any lumps, it doesn't really matter too much. Try and get them out as much as possible, but don't worry too much. Okay, now this is now your sourdough starter, the whole thing. And then we're going to pop that in a jar. I like to put it in a kiln jar and then mark where the level is. Sometimes you get a rise when you're feeding it on the 1-to-1 ratio, sometimes not. But you should see a few bubbles on the top after about 8 hours, but you can leave it up to 24 depending on how hungry it is, or depend on how long it takes to activate. And then we cover that with the lid. I like to leave the lid just slightly propped open so there's a little bit of an air gap. I don't shut it tight. I mark the side, and then we'll leave that and we'll come back in about 8 hours to see how it's doing. I'm also going to prepare a whole grain as well, exactly the same method, because whole grain looks slightly different to white. Whole grain also looks like spelt and rye with regards it doesn't seem as gloopy. So that will give you a view of how they both look. Hopefully we will get some nice bubbles and it will be quite active. On the off chance that it's just very hungry and might need an extra feed, hopefully I'll prepare a couple of extra ones to be able to show you that as well. Okay, see you in about 8 hours. So it's now been approximately 7 hours since we fed the sourdough starter, and this ideally is how you want it to look. So we have got a pretty good rise there. You can see lots of bubbles and aeration. And if we look from the top, you can see it's nice and bubbly on the top. So that's perfect. It's just beginning to collapse back down again. So right now it's at peak activity. This is the perfect point where if you've done a build feed, you would want to be making the bread with it. But we don't always get that, especially when it's been in the post. So here's the one that I fed earlier. Now this one, I'd actually left that pouch sitting on the cupboard top for a week to simulate it if it had had the longest delay in delivery. And if we have a look, there's not been much of a rise, if any, but there are a few bubbles in it. And if we can just look from the top, we can see a few bubbles. So it's not looking particularly active. So before we go on to what we will do, we'll just have a look at another example. This is the whole grain one that I also fed earlier. Now this one looks a little bit more active. You can see a rise. There are some bubbles within it, but not many breaking the surface. So I've had a few people saying, well, there's no bubbles, it's not very active. But if you had looked in the bulk of it, you can see some bubbles, but it's not massively active. And finally, this is another common problem that we see. This is actually a spelt starter, and I get a lot of messages saying it's split, nothing's happening. So it hasn't split. Well, it has, but technically it hasn't split. This is not just water that's just come back out of the mixture that you've made. This is actually alcohol that you can see in that layer, and that's caused by fermentation, and it's actually a sign that it's been fermenting and it's very, very hungry. So you've got two options with this. You can either just mix it all back in. When it's like kind of like straw colour or clear colour, I'll mix it back in. If it starts to get quite dark, which it can if it's been sitting for a while or it's been in the fridge for a long time, you can just pour that bit of alcohol away and then go on to the next step. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with this. This is actually a sign that it's just very hungry. So what do we do if we want to get a more active starter? So if we go back to this one again, because I think this is the least active looking one. What I would do for this to give it a boost and get it going is I'd actually only take 20 grams of this. So here's 50 grams of water, and then I'd add to that only 20 grams of this starter, because it's still very hungry, and feeding it on the 1-to-1 ratio, it doesn't probably have enough food to give it a good boost. So we're actually going to feed it on a slightly higher than 1-to-2 ratio instead. So that's roughly about 20 grams. You don't need to be too precise. And then to that, we're going to add the 50 grams of flour. And then we're going to just mix it up like before. I mean, I like to use clean jars just because it really helps you to monitor the growth. But if you wanted to kind of just discard some and then add it back into the same jar, you can. But do make sure you wash your jars fairly regularly. Don't keep it in there forever. I'm going to pop that in and now leave that for another 8 hours, and I expect to see quite a bit of change this time, much more activity. So the reasons why sometimes it's not particularly active, as I said before, it might be very cold, which sort of simulates it being in the fridge, and this is what you'll find the activity's like if you've had it in a fridge for a week or two. It will take a few goes to get going, or it might have been somewhere quite warm and then it's just fermenting, it'll produce more alcohol, it will just be very, very hungry, and it might be over acidified. So by taking a smaller amount, that will help reduce the acidity for when you give it the feed. So that will help both situations really. So we'll see how that goes. I'm going to repeat that with the spelt one with the alcohol layer on top and the whole grain one, and hopefully in about 8 hours we'll see a lot more activity for all 3 of them. It's now been about 14 hours because it wasn't doing much before I went to bed last night. So I thought I'd leave it overnight, give it a little bit extra time. And if we take a look at the white, which was looking very sorry for itself, you can see it's actually risen up and started to collapse back down now. But we are getting a nice aeration within. And if we look from the top, it is super bubbly. So that is really good now. And then if we have a look at the whole grain, see how this looks a little bit different. So if we look from the top, it never looks as bubbly as white, but you often see with the whole grain, it can look a lot more spongier from the side. So that one's really good. And finally the spelt, which was looking very sorry for itself, has come back nicely as well. So that's nice sponginess seen from the side. It's risen up and collapsed back down again, so you won't see it at its full force, but again from the top, similar to whole grain, you won't see as many bubbles on the top with spelt, rye and whole grain. So the second feeding has taken them nicely, and from now on I'd be happy to maintain these or keep them in the fridge for a week, but bear in mind that will might need an extra feed to get it going again. or from here to do a build feed and get baking that bread. Okay, thanks for watching.